this year's Palm Beach Atlantic University Interdisciplinary Conference. Now, this is one of my favorite PBA traditions because it gives us an amazing opportunity to see our undergraduate students, graduate students, and faculty present all of their hard work and research in their various topics. And it's an amazing opportunity to get a glance at all of our disciplines. Now, this year, we incorporated the theme, Focus on Your Future, to encourage students to take their research and leverage this into possible future career options. It's an amazing chance that I think fits perfectly with PBA's Inspiring Excellence, Mind, Body, Spirit. Now, this year, we have in your program an outline of all of the events, and after I'm done speaking, Dr. Poe will get up and introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Tarver. Thank you all so much for being here, and I hope that you'll get the opportunity throughout the next 2 days to visit as many presentations as possible, because I know it would mean a lot to all of our faculty and students who have done such hard work, as you can see from all of the 20 posters around. At the end of this keynote presentation, please join us out on the patio as we will have a light refreshments and then go straight into the presentations. Please join me in prayer. Dear Father, I thank you so much for this opportunity to come together and recognize the intellectual gifts that you have bestowed upon us. I thank you for all the hard work that we can physically see around this room. And I thank you for just this passion for learning that you've given us and that you've given us PBA as a place where we can live this out. I thank you for bringing all of us here together, and I thank you for the future that we have. I pray that we would always continue to seek whatever you have gifted us with, and that we can use this in our futures to glory and honor you, God. I pray this in your holy name, amen. Dr. Poe?
Thank you, President-elect Kane. Very nice. Welcome. Glad you're all here with us today. Good turnout. Excited to see that. Students on the front row, we always like that, definitely. It is a great privilege and honor to get to introduce today's speaker. I must also admit to a little bit of pride in this as well, as Dr. Tarver is a former student, of course. It is at times like this I feel good about what I get to do here at PBA. The opportunity to share learning experiences with these individuals and see them go out and graduate and become leaders and outstanding individuals brings a real sense of fulfillment in this kind of work. I have known Dr. Tarver for close to 20 years now. We were trying to figure that out last night. I'm not sure when exactly I first had you in class. But this sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in seeing what people go on to become, Dr. Tarver is a good example of this. She was, of course, a very talented and smart student while here at PBA, as some of her former members of the teachers here at PBA could also agree with me on this, I think. I am blessed that I had her as a student and was able to watch her build on her PBA experience here, and to watch that development and then see her go on to do the things she's done has brought me a good bit of fulfillment. But Dr. Tarver is a very accomplished scholar and philosophy teacher in and of herself. And you've got some of her information, I think, there, but just to highlight a few things, she currently is the assistant professor of philosophy at Emory University's Oxford College, where she teaches. They live there just outside of Atlanta with her husband Joshua, who also teaches philosophy at Emory. A rare feat indeed to be able to pull that off where you're both teaching at the same place in the same discipline. Along with her four-legged friends, her dog Otis, and their two cats. And to understand who Erin is, you have to understand Otis as well. She has also taught at James Madison University, at Georgetown College, and Niagara University. Dr. Tarver studied at Boston College after she left Palm Beach Atlantic, where she got her MA in philosophy, and then went on to do a PhD in philosophy at Vanderbilt University. She has written and presented on a number of topics related to philosophy and issues of identity. Most importantly, and what we're going to hear her talk about today, is her most recent book, The I in Team Sports, Fandom and the Reproduction of Identity. And so we look forward to that as well. So, of course, she is a very accomplished scholar, and while I would like to take credit for all of that, she has almost always kind of been out there ahead of me in many ways. I can recall specifically a discussion we once had in a class about the scholastic philosopher Anselm of Canterbury. Yes, I think she remembers this. I probably honestly downplayed the importance of his contributions to Christian thought, and especially gave a probably weak presentation on his ontological argument for the existence of God. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you'll understand, and so you can talk to Dr. Tarver afterwards about that. But anyway, Erin was able to not only present his thought better than I had, but helped us all to have a better appreciation for the significance of his argument, for which I was very thankful. But she didn't stop there, and to help me remember his significance, she brought me back a picture she took of his burial site and memorial inside of the cathedral in Canterbury. I still have that picture over my desk in my office as a reminder that as a teacher we should also be learning from our students. Let's see. Erin has, of course, always been that kind of a learner, and for as long as I can remember, she was a welcome addition to my classes. Erin also became like family for us as she joined us when we did the London semester in the spring of 2002. Now, back then, when we did the London semester, it was very different. We weren't going to a university and you weren't living with students. We actually rented a very large flat in the Marble Arch section of London, and we actually, my family and the students, all lived in a flat together, which made for some very interesting interactions as well. Like when my wife would get up in the mornings and find piles of dishes in the sink, and she couldn't find her coffee cup. And that was always a challenge for all of us. But we couldn't help but grow close then, and she has always been a part of our family ever since. I think it's appropriate that Erin is here today as we emphasize the importance of interdisciplinary research. Because while as Erin is a philosophy professor, her research and work in philosophy often transcends that and informs so many questions about who we are and why we think about things the way we do. And in fact, in the most recent edition of the Emory magazine, which I just happen to have here, Dr. Tarver is featured as one of the Fab Five of faculty at Emory University, touting her as one of 5 faculty members at Emory who are, quote, blurring lines, bridging disciplines, and pushing boundaries. It particularly highlights her interest in, quote, trying to understand the deepest questions surrounding human identity. In light of some of these interests, she began to look into her own identity and recognized the many forces that shaped who she was, forces in American culture, and especially her identity as a sports fan. And it was this interest which began her research on sports fandom and its implications for an individual's identity. Now, of course, I don't relate to this at all because I'm not a sports fan and I have no ties to any particular teams. Now, all my students roll their eyes when I say that. Yes, go Broncos. But this eventually led to the publication of her book, The I in Team, Sports Fandom and the Reproduction of Identity. This research even carried over into an op-ed she published last fall in the New York Times, where she challenged fans to consider ideas like whether their fanaticism really saw players as persons or more simply as just mascots. Her work raises many important questions about the place of sports in our culture and even in higher education. And in fact, just this last month, on the front of the Chronicle of Higher Education, you have a whole article focusing on Sorry if you're an Auburn fan. No, I'm not really. Auburn University, in the sense of trying to create a athlete-friendly curriculum. So in the sense, athletics driving the whole notion of even the curriculum at the university there at Auburn. So I think this is a very timely topic for sure. Her editorial elicited a variety of responses, both positive and negative, with her ideas there. And while we may not have all the answers to these questions today, I ask you to listen intently to Erin's presentation. So join me in welcoming my friend and co-teacher, Dr. Erin Tarver.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for very generous introduction, Gary. And thank you all for being here. Good morning. I am so delighted to return to PBA, where I started my own academic journey. Yes, nearly 20 years ago. I can't believe that it's been so long at this point. Working at a college, you always feel like you're a young person because you're surrounded by young people. Turns out that's not true forever. So I want to thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the Alumni Office, and especially I want to thank Marcus Brazil for his work in organizing this event and my visit. It's all been wonderful. Thank you as well to my professors here at PBA, especially those in the Supper Honors Program, including Tom St. Antoine, Beata Rodewald, Kathleen Anderson, who I think had to step out for class, who all, during my time here at PBA, pushed me to excel and inspired me to discover my own love for learning. And a massive, massive thank you to my former teacher and my dear friend Gary Poe for inviting me, or nominating me rather, for this, and for being an incredible inspiration and support both academically and personally. You and your family mean so much to me, and I'm so, so glad that you're in my life. So, the title of my talk today is Knowing Thyself as a Sports Fan, Ethical and Political Concerns. This is a subject, or really I should say a combination of subjects, that I first began exploring here at PBA. Spring semester of my freshman year, two things happened that in retrospect had a pivotal role in my scholarly life. For some time, I actually only recognized one of these things as important, but in retrospect, I realized that two have converged to result in the book project that I'm going to talk with you about today. The first thing was that in my freshman honors seminar, I read Cicero's On the Good Life. I fell in love with philosophy while reading that text, agonizing over Cicero's discussion of whether it were better to seem like a good person to others or to truly be a good person in the deepest sense. Now, perhaps because I was at the time a theater major, or perhaps because I grew up in the church and I had internalized a deep concern about whether in my heart my motives were pure, I found myself at once haunted and compelled by a passage of the text in which Cicero quoted Socrates. Make yourself the sort of person you want people to think that you are. As I turned more deeply to philosophy, I never lost my abiding concern for discovering the truly good life, nor for the philosophical command that many of Socrates' contemporaries and predecessors believed to be the most important, that is, the command to know thyself. Though some may deride it as navel-gazing, the philosopher recognizes that knowing oneself is at once the most challenging and the most crucial of tasks for those who would concern themselves with justice. Am I truly good? Or do I merely seem so? Are my motivations what I imagine them to be, or am I implicated in injustice without realizing it? Knowing thyself means confronting the dark, hidden places in one's soul and recognizing our role in public wrongs that we may rectify them. This concern for the self and its implication in larger social patterns of injustice is what animates all of my scholarly work today. So the second thing that happened my freshman year was that I was in Dr. Tom St. Antoine's speech class. So Dr. St. Antoine, for those of you who do not know, is a graduate of Louisiana State University, which is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I grew up. So Dr. Stan and I quickly realized that we shared a deep and abiding love for LSU football, sometimes annoying other students in the class with our recapitulation of classic games or coaching choices. So I recognized in this situation an opportunity to, as the old adage goes, write what you know. And so I made one of my 3 major speeches in the course an ode to the greatness of LSU football. So at the time, I thought of this mostly as a bit of fun and contrasted with my heavier and more serious investigations of Stoicism and physics and the historical development of early Christianity. But in retrospect, I realize now just how important it was to me that Dr. Stan allowed me to pursue sport as an academic exercise. Broadly speaking, I would say I have built my philosophical career on recognizing in the most mundane features of everyday life material for serious reflection. But more importantly, I've come to understand that truly knowing myself, subjecting my actions, social practices, and desires to philosophical scrutiny, that this requires being willing even to question the things that I love, like sports. It requires, as my title indicates, a courageous willingness to know thyself as a sports fan, and to be open to the possibility that even these small pleasures require more of me, both ethically and politically. So in what follows, I will offer the briefest of introductions to my philosophical analysis of sports fandom, which is in this book, and I'll explain why I think that careful analysis of it, of sports fandom, should call forth in us both ethical and political concerns. I will not argue that sports fandom is necessarily ethically suspect, but I will suggest that if we are committed to the pursuit of justice, and determined to live good lives, we must ask ourselves whether we should change the way that we engage with it. So what follows is, in part, an excerpt from the first chapter of my book. The term fan is shot through with values. Although this might come as a surprise to people who are not particularly interested in sports, or to sports fans who have not spent much time reflecting philosophically on their fandom, the concept's value-laden nature is apparent as soon as we attempt to answer the question, who is a fan? The mere act of defining our terms, crucial in any philosophical analysis, requires us to stake out the limits of fandom, to make calls on who is in and who is outside of the fan community, which, as most sports fans will tell you, is a necessarily controversial bit of business. Proving that someone is or is not a fan often involves parsing the smallest details of a spectator's knowledge, behavior, or feeling, analyzing their claim to fandom with the rigor of a tax attorney, investigating whether a particular lunch satisfies the criteria for a business expense deduction. Making matters more complicated is the fact that standards for the application of the term fan are as unclear as they are frequently invoked. Claims about who counts as a real fan are common among fan groups, but those claims are far from univocal in their content. Fans tend to be particularly interested in, as reception theorist Daniel Cavici puts it, quote, distinguishing themselves from non-fan audience members. And this end is accomplished through a wide variety of practices, including speech, dress, collections, and travel, just to name a few. In its most exacting forms, fandom prescribes a thickly normative testing regimen, repeated demands by one's peers for proof that one is a real fan, distinct from a poser, or worse, a mere rider on the bandwagon. Implicit in the fan concept, then, is a set of expectations about how one ought to behave as a sporting enthusiast. I'm going to show you several quotes here from different people and types of sources that I think emphasize or make clear what I'm talking about in terms of the value-laden nature here. So Nicholas Dixon here is a philosopher of sport, and he's talking about who does or does not qualify as a fan. So the normative status of the fan concept thus goes beyond the sort of normativity that is implicit in any philosophical definition. It is undoubtedly true that, as post-structuralist thinkers such as Judith Butler have pointed out, conceptual clarification always requires the assertion of some kind of norm. As soon as I specify the referent of the term woman, for example, I involve myself in claims about what one must be in order to count as a woman, and the exclusion of some persons from that category. Likewise, defining even less contested terms always requires some degree of world chopping. To define a circle is to specify the ideal type of that shape, and simultaneously to say that it is not a square or triangle, etc. But fan is normatively loaded not only by virtue of the nature of linguistic distinctions or the inherently limiting character of definitions. Its specific content is normative. Fan denotes a kind of spectator who is marked out from others, a fanatic whose status exceeds, somehow, that of a mere audience member, whether for good or ill. It is a concept with a history, an extraordinary form of audiencing whose very name makes explicit its excesses. The term itself exists to mark the advent of a new, and at least at its inception, an aberrant form of interaction with sport. I don't know if you can see this, but that's from 1888 in the Cincinnati newspaper. Historically, it was, in other words, not a nice thing to call someone, a way to note the inappropriateness of their sporting engagement. We have another example of this here. This is from Ted Sullivan, who was a baseball manager in the 1890s. Sullivan has several different ways of recounting the story. He believes that he's the one who made up the term fan, and he used it to talk about basically people who would show up in his clubhouse and try to tell him how to run his team, and it got so bad that he had to have people warn him when certain people were going to come around, and the way they warned him was to say, "The fan is coming." And so this is another place where he makes clear that he doesn't appreciate these people who he calls fans. So although the implicit normative claim involved in calling someone a fan has, of course, shifted over time, evolving from derision to legitimation, the application of the term almost always relies on a set of assumptions about respectable spectator engagement. Fan is, in other words, a concept that is not value neutral, whereas circle carries norms for its application that make no prescriptions beyond how the word should be used. Fan not only carries norms for its application, but also makes implicit claims about standards of behavior. Those claims can be more or less prescriptive, depending on the extent to which one understands norm to indicate, on the one hand, that which is typical, or on the other, that to which one ought to conform. So there's two different versions of the word norm that we use in English. Now, as feminists have pointed out, the lines between these two senses of the word norm tend to actually get blurred fairly often in the cases of human behavior, as the typical comes to be imbued with prescriptive force. So for evidence of this claim, we need only reflect on the previously widespread practice of forcing all children to be right-handed, because most were. Or the subjection contemporarily of perfectly healthy children or adults to cosmetic surgeries, simply because their bodies do not resemble those of typical boys or girls, men or women. Because the suspicion of abnormality is such a powerful tool of socialization, one might have expected that sports fandom would remain the domain of social outcasts and the generally weird, given its initial association with abnormally obsessed baseball enthusiasts. Yet, as fans grow their numbers and sports fandom becomes more widespread, the term gains its own prescriptive force, whose implicit claims about how sporting enthusiasts ought to behave are evident in interactions like this one. So I'll just read to you this little quote. So this is from a woman named Jillian. She says, "In 8th grade, this boy Alex said that he was going to the Mets game that night, and I was too. I said I was a huge Mets fan, and I was so excited. He said, and I quote, 'I hate it when girls say they are fans of a team. They don't know anything about it.' I said, 'Of course I know about the Mets.' He told me to prove it, and he asked me to name 3 players on the team. I named the entire 40-man roster." So both Alex and Jillian are here subscribing to particular norms about how fans ought to behave, namely norms around knowledge acquisition. And Alex in particular, like many young men, in fact, takes a certain identifiable quantum of propositional knowledge to be an indicator of one's appropriate fandom. So when attempting to answer the question of what a fan is, it is useful to consider the various descriptions of sports fandom we've encountered thus far. So each one, from the 1880s crank to Alex's idealized Mets fan to the philosopher Dixon's claim about sports purists, shares two common characteristics: caring about a sport that they observe, that is, having some degree of affective investment in it, and engaging in some kind of activity through which that care is expressed, cultivated, or enhanced. Although the objects of that affective investment and the types of activity used to express or cultivate it may take a variety of forms, in each case we have both a feeling component, I would say, and a practice component. Normative claims about what makes a good fan turn on specific beliefs about the proper content or expression of these components. For the 8th grade Alex, fans are characterized not only by team allegiance, but by a practice of knowledge acquisition. On this view, the feeling might be important, but it must be verified through practice to count as legitimate. For others, I'd say, affective loyalty to the team is cashed out in specific actions. It is demonstrated and reinforced through participation in chants, the wearing of certain clothing, sometimes the tattooing of one's body. Though the specific content of fan, the word, changes, what remains constant in the normativity of its application is the requirement that fans both feel a connection to their team or sport and put this felt connection into practice. The combination of these two dimensions distinguishes fans from persons who merely attend or happen to watch sporting events. That these two components jointly characterize sports fans is perhaps most evident when contrasting them with non-fans. So anyone who's watched a sporting event with an audience of mixed levels of sporting enthusiasm, I'm thinking here about Super Bowl parties and that sort of stuff, will likely have observed a difference between the general comportment of fans and non-fans toward the games in question. So I experienced a particularly striking example of this when taking two different groups of students to see Atlanta Braves games in the 2014 and 2015 baseball seasons. The first was a group of international students who had never seen a baseball game, and the second was a group from my philosophy of sport course, almost all of whom had attended a baseball game previously. So some of the latter group, the philosophy of sport kids, identified as baseball fans and some didn't, but all identified as fans of some sport. Both groups of students were jovial and enthusiastic about the experience of being at the ballpark. They took photos, they participated in the wave. But whereas the latter group of students were clearly invested in the game, they brought baseball gloves, they cheered for well-executed plays, they groaned at bad swings, they resisted the idea of leaving early despite the fact that the weather was atrocious and we had a looming deadline to get back to campus. The former definitely were not. Although this non-fan group participated in some practice components of fandom, so the aforementioned wave, say, clapping for the home team, attending the game itself, they did so, unsurprisingly, without any accompanying emotional investment. Though they very generously listened to my explanations of the game, they were much more interested in watching the constantly changing big screen for images of people dancing in the stands, or embracing for the kiss cam, and cheering for the Home Depot tool race. That's the mascot race in Atlanta. So while it is undeniable that the tool race and the stadium's big screen are entertaining, we could not dispute that, they are not part of the game as such. Fans are distinct from non-fans by caring about what happens in the game and engaging with it actively. Now, of course, as we've said, among fans there's significant disagreement about how much care is required and how it ought to be demonstrated, and individual sports fans tend to have strong opinions about whether other fans of their acquaintance perform their fandom in acceptable ways. This fact is, I have suggested, an unsurprising feature of a category that is fundamentally normative in nature. To be a fan is to be a special type of spectator. Given the shift in connotations of the term fan from negative to positive there are bound to be disagreements about the standards one must embody in order to merit the term. So though I don't take a particular normative stand on the specifics of fan behavior, it is crucial, I think, to note that fans are distinguishable from mere spectators. I've argued that this distinction hinges on fans' combination of care about and practice in relation to a sport or a team. So unlike most fans, then, I am actually using a broad definition of fan in an effort to include as many different modes of invested sports spectatorship as possible. I do not restrict fandom to those persons who feel or perform their fandom in specific ways, and in particular, I do not restrict it to those who possess some identifiable quantum of sports knowledge, since, as philosopher Paul Snowden points out, quote, one's level of competence and understanding do not determine the importance in one's life of things, end quote. So as it is precisely the importance of sports fandom in the lives of contemporary Americans that I aim to explain in my book, I think it would be particularly unproductive to limit my inquiry only to a specific subset of those fans. Narrowing the definition of fan, as fans do, moreover, would keep us from recognizing the full scope of what it means to know ourselves and others as sports fans. And I think, ironically, the ethical questions that sports fandom raises, or should raise, which I think I'm sort of alluding to in some of these images, these ethical questions that sports fandom should raise tend to be obscured when the more narrowly normative theoretical definitions of fan are assumed. If we restrict fandom to the practices of attending games and painting our faces, or knowing the names of particular players on a team, or feeling a particular way toward umpires that make calls that are unfavorable to our teams, we may miss out on various ways that sports fandom affects our lives and the lives of others outside the game. In other words, restricting sports fandom to the realm of the arena or the game itself can keep us from seeing just how far-reaching it can be as a cultural practice. And this matters, I think, because some of those cultural practices should raise serious ethical and political concerns for us. Beyond the range of practices in contemporary sports fandom, there's another reason, I think, to take a broad view of what fandom means. To put it simply, the typically narrow outlook of those defining real fans, I think, actually takes too much for granted. Attention to the historical development of the concept of fans makes this taking for granted particularly salient. Not only is it the case that contemporary fan debates about who counts as a real fan often make use of arbitrary distinctions, these contemporary debates presume fandom as a normative ideal. They think it's a good thing, right? They think it's something you're supposed to strive to be, rather than as an aberrant and potentially disturbing mode of spectator relations. That it was not always so. That fan has shifted so much in connotation in the last century and a half is obscured in typical fan engagements with the normative character of fan as a term. The shifting status of fans and fan behavior is crucial information, I think, with which to engage if we're to understand both the force of sports fandom in contemporary life, as well as how and why it comes to be so important for both individual and community identity today. Sports fans have existed since the late 19th century, but neither their habits, nor their emotions, nor their cultural positions have remained constant. Contemporary fans, likewise, comprise a motley crew of partisans, purists, trivia mavens, strategists, and simple flag wavers. If anything can be said to unite this group, it's that their fandom involves both care and practice. Knowing thyself or others as sports fans, then, requires attention to the details of fan practice in concrete social contexts. And this is what I do in the book. So investigating these, such as the ones I'm looking at here, we will find that sports fandom's normative effects are not limited to implicit claims about fan behavior. Rather, sports fandom exerts normative force, communicating values, making claims about who belongs in the community and who does not, teaching modes of acceptable engagement with rivals. Sports fandom exerts this kind of force well beyond the sporting arena, Sports fandom then is not only a normative concept, it is, as a practice, a means of creating and reinforcing social norms and values. The question for us, as philosophers, or as people just concerned with justice, is with what social norms and values sports fandom actually reinforces. Are they good social norms and values? This is the subject of my book. But I'll leave you with an example from my own life, which I think of as clearly connected to ongoing ethical and political controversies in football, and which has forced me to confront the role of racism, sexism, and the glorification of violence in my own experiences as a sports fan. So reflecting on the role of sports fandom in my life, I am haunted by a recurrent memory of one night in LSU's Tiger Stadium in the early 1990s. The air is thick with humidity, and I am squealing with laughter as my friend, another preteen white girl, and I scream a chant that we recently learned. The chant is funny to us because it is transgressive. It is funny and daring because we are girls who are frustrated with being excluded from the boys' events at Sunday school, which are all adventure and competition, and angry about being expected to be nice, sweet, and content with sleepovers. The chant is funny and daring and empowering, it seems, because its words, "Kill, kill, blood makes the grass grow," position us as privileged persons whose amusement is built upon the explicit denigration and instrumentalization of others, whose prone bodies on the field remind us not of the frailty of human life, but of the ease with which we could make ourselves significant, if only we managed to respond to violence, to masculinity, and to the ordinary expectations of others in the right ways. I don't remember where we learned the chant, but I know that we were eventually reprimanded for using it. We had not performed our fandom appropriately. I cannot shake the feeling, however, that what was inappropriate in our chant was not the expression of pleasure at the misfortunes of our rivals, or even the sense that the bodies of these men were disposable or existed for our satisfaction. Such sentiments, I think, are expressed each day by sports fans across the country. But what we did, was we made the implicit explicit. An explicitness made all the more striking and disturbing by our youth and by our femininity. I see myself in that stadium, asserting my individuality by refusing to be a lady, and cultivating my sense of belonging in the culture and traditions of South Louisiana by calling for the blood sacrifice of young men, mostly young Black men, whose bodies were broken for the glory of my home. I see myself there, and I shudder at how very entangled my own identity is with such horrors. I hope it's possible to do sports fandom differently. We will not find this out without first exposing its evils just below the surface. So knowing oneself as a sports fan in contemporary America is not easy. It requires confronting what it is within ourselves that is willing to tolerate permanent brain damage that we now know comes with football. It requires reflecting on why we are fine with using athletes to perform rituals of nationalism and bring glory to our hometown or state, but respond with anger when they want to express political views of their own. It requires thinking carefully about what we as fans would have to do differently in order to prevent athletics programs from amassing such power that their coaches or athletes are effectively above the law, or to reimagine college athletics so that its business model is not dependent upon economic exploitation. So knowing oneself as a sports fan is not always fun and games, I'm afraid. But it is necessary, especially for those of us who would follow Socrates' advice. Make yourself the kind of person, perhaps the kind of fan, that you want people to think that you are. Thank you.
Have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions now. You should receive the note card on your way in. If you'll write down a question and pass those over, maybe Marcus can pick those up. I have a question to get us going, and then as we pick those up, tell me about the differences between, is there a difference between college fans and pro fans? And then even you talked about norms, like in college, does the fandom of college, does that create a stronger norm than some of the norms of academia? So the Auburn article that Gary alluded to, where then they're going to give you a kind of faux degree because you're an athlete, and some of the kind of big D1 high money
Right.
type sports
Right.
type stuff.
Okay, good.
Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. So the question, I'm supposed to restate this so that people who are perhaps watching online can hear it. So the question was, number one, is there a difference between college and pro sports fans? And number two was about whether there's, I'm trying to figure out how to state this, in specifically college athletics, if we can talk about the ways that the power of college athletics enforces norms in ways that it go perhaps contrary to the higher education institution. So to question one, I would say, yes, certainly, depending on what part of the country you're in the United States, college and professional athletics varies quite a bit. So for example, a lot of the examples that I give of sports fandom in the South have to do with college athletics, and that's because college athletics is much more powerful in the U.S. South than is professional athletics. And there's actually good historical reasons for that in terms of the traditions of college athletics. So whereas in the Midwest and the Northeast, there are professional sports teams dating from the 19th century. That's just not the case in the South. But what there were institutions of higher education, which were explicitly in the South attempting to emulate the traditions of their northern, we'll say, aspirant peers in the language of higher education. So Ole Miss, for example, explicitly selects the colors that it does, the crimson and navy blue, they wanted to echo Harvard and Yale, respectively, because those two had those colors. So certainly when we look at different forms of fandom in different parts of the United States, we'll find different sets of practices associated with different teams, and usually those happen to be tied to locales. So a big part of what I do in my project is look philosophically at this stuff, but I'm taking seriously the importance of looking philosophically at empirical data, findings from social scientists and all of that stuff, rather than making sort of universalizing claims about sports fans. So it will always depend, I think, on the specific context. Regarding higher education, I think this is an enormous and messy problem in the United States, particularly around D1 college athletics. And I mean, we can see this just even in like the image that I have here. This is even before, I believe, the LSU football stadium was expanded yet again to include another one of these like upper deck things. Now, the reason I mention that as an example is that there's many cases like this where the athletics programs are quite wealthy, right, and have the abilities to build state-of-the-art facilities for their athletes, but the institutional structures of the higher education bit of the university are sort of missing and crumbling and embarrassing, frankly. So I think that is an example of the way this works structurally, such that the norms around sports fandom become so strong that people feel that this is what the purpose of the university is to do this particular thing and to play the role in my life or my family's life, right, of giving me these traditions that I can go to reinforce my sense of belonging in the community and all of that. And that the educational mission of the institution becomes secondary. And I think we see that here, but we also see that, of course, in the Auburn case that you mentioned. We see that there was a similar sort of scandal that erupted in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a couple of years ago around the basketball program. And there's actually a philosophy professor who was involved in this scandal in which people were signing up for what they called paper courses. So essentially hundreds of students were signed up to take directed studies with this professor. And they were all athletes, and it wasn't clear that anything actually happened, but that they were like signing off on grades and things like that. So I think this is one of the big dangers of people being so emotionally invested in this stuff, is it seems to lead to precisely this sort of outcome. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I guess I would say two things about this. Number one is that I don't mean to suggest that like D1 athletes are bad people or anything like that. I think a big piece of what I try to do is to say that I think that very often D1 athletes are exploited and treated as less than human, and I think it's quite disturbing. But certainly the fact that there's such a wide range of athlete experiences is quite important, even at the level just of D1. So when we're talking about the difference between what we call revenue sports versus non-revenue sports, so by that I mean revenue sports includes like football, baseball, basketball, right? The things that make money, that have the greatest fan following. Those things tend to subsidize, in fact, the non-revenue sports. So things like volleyball and golf and all of that. Different athletes, even at the same institution, if we're talking about a D1 institution, can have very different experiences that some people, so there's a scholar working out of Arizona right now who suggests, she was an athlete in one of these non-revenue sports. She says, like, this is actually deeply problematic. My entire college education was subsidized by the labor of these other people who, spent the equivalent of a full-time job on the practice field and then also had to pretend to go to class and that sort of stuff. Never seen a dime for any of it, but raising, of course, enormous wealth for the university. And then at the end of it, maybe they don't even have an education because they didn't go to classes or, I think that there are, even within the context of a D1 institution, like varying levels of what athletics looks like, certainly. And the fact that we do focus on this so pervasively tends to obscure other things that should be concerning to us, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So I would say this is not too much my wheelhouse, but here's what I'll say about this. My next project, I'll just tell you now and then you can boo me later. My next project is a book-length argument for the abolition of the NCAA. And I say this with no pleasure because I am a sports fan, and I think athletics is actually really important as a means of education, but I think it needs to be shifted in the way that it's run. When I told my dean this, the dean of my college, he was not happy, and he pointed out to me like, oh, this is actually really important for us in terms of applications and revenue and all of that. And I say, that's true. I'm not sure that's a good business model. I think that there are many things that are effective for the ends of driving application numbers, for producing money, for being even business savvy, right? But that doesn't mean that they're good, ethically speaking. And so my concern as a philosopher idealistic as it may sound, has always been with justice. And so I try to take the argument where it leads me in that regard, even though it might not be what a lot of people want to hear. Thank you.